Carolyn Cook is an artist and writer whose work has appeared in McSweeney's, Ms. Magazine, and elsewhere. The name of her novel is Tell Them to Be Quiet and Wait. She graduated from Dartmouth in 2021, so you can see she's quite young. And this is a new effort for her. She's tuned in from California, and we can ask her what she's doing out there at some point. Also, I talked to Allie at Still North Books, Carolyn, and she has copies of your book. She couldn't come tonight to sell them, but she has copies, and you can, and many of us here can go and buy copies of the book. There's also a copy of the book here at Howe Library, which I have read. I've read your book, and I do have some questions for you. So go, take it away, Carolyn.
Great. I'm going to, so I have a slide show that I don't need to use, but it's not letting me share it. So I'll just start talking. First, thank you all for coming. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Caroline Cook, a Dartmouth alum and the author of Tell Them to Be Quiet and Wait. Oh, I might be able to share my screen now. I can. Okay. Okay, great. Let me just. Perfect. Okay. Everyone can see that? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to talk today about a very important member of the Hanover community, which sounds like many of you know, whose relationship to the town and the college is very complex. My research focused primarily on the Dartmouth side, not the Hanover side, but as we all know, they're very intertwined. So I'm going to get into some of that in a bit. I'm here today because my freshman year at Dartmouth, I didn't know what to do with my summer break. One of my professors had mentioned that I might check out Ronner Special Collections Library. She'd heard that the library was accepting applications for a new fellowship, and she thought I might enjoy archival research. She was right. I went into Ronner and sat down with Jay Satterfield, the head of special collections, and asked him to tell me what kind of topics a fellow might research. The Historical Accountability Research Fellowship was new, and I was amazed at the premise. The college was hiring students to investigate lesser-known parts of its history. It takes a certain amount of courage for an institution to encourage this, to be willing to wrestle with whatever is unearthed, good or bad. That day, Jay mentioned that he'd always wanted someone to explore the story of Hannah Crosdale, Dartmouth's first female professor to receive tenure, and the first full professor in arts and sciences. And that's how I became Ronner's first Historical Accountability Research Fellow. I was immediately hooked by Hannah's story. That fateful day in the library, Jay and I pulled up a website about her, which was just a few pages and some photos that hadn't been updated since 2002. The feeling that immediately struck me is what I believe is really at the heart of this program and all of the research that followed. I looked at these pictures like this one, and thought, why didn't I already know about her? Why did I, as a student in the first 50 classes of women at Dartmouth, never stop and think about who this person might have been? The fellowship encourages this kind of meditation, a real engagement with what it means to inherit a complicated history. As my weeks in Ronner began and I settled into my routine, I was consistently surprised by her. Dr. Hannah Crosdale started at the college in 1935 during the Depression with a PhD from Penn in biology. She'd been doing research and teaching at Woods Hole Marine Lab in Massachusetts for several years, and yet she came to Dartmouth as a lab tech. Years later, the situation was described, according to then Dean Arthur Jensen, quote, Dr. Crosdale had the misfortune of being a woman. In the Depression, she accepted a position as a technician in the zoology department, even though her PhD and obvious scientific competence warranted a much better job. There is no question of her scientific competence, end quote. He elaborated that another faculty member in the department, quote, told me that she is one of the half dozen best algologists in the country. It wasn't until John Kemeny became president at Dartmouth in 1970 that Hannah learned how little she'd been paid compared to her male colleagues, Pay transparency was something Kemeny thought was important. He was also the one to spearhead Dartmouth's move towards coeducation.
Right.
Hannah had at times been making only 60% of her male peers' salaries and had needed to supplement her income from Dartmouth by illustrating textbooks, which I think is what we were discussing when I joined the call. It took Hannah another 24 years to be promoted to associate professor. She did not get tenure until 1964, making her the first woman to do so. And in that time, she was publishing papers of such importance that she received letters from phycologists all over the world. I've read correspondence from India, Poland, Sweden, asking for her professional opinion. A famous scientist died in Finland, and the university sent her his promising unfinished work and asked her to complete it. She was a founder and later the president of the Phycological Society of America in the 60s. The faith that the rest of the world had in Hannah was as large as her place at Dartmouth was small. What surprised me more than the twists and turns in her life, though, was the clear image that came into focus for me of the people at the college and the world in which they lived. I began to recognize the handwriting of a particularly verbose dean, read yellowed articles in the D by the same handfuls of student reporters. I was fully immersed in their world. I had to be, to properly contextualize what I was reading about Hannah's story. To understand who was quoted in this letter or memo, I'd spend a day or two diving into that person's life, career, and family. I've read every issue of the Dartmouth yearbook from the 1930s through the 1980s. And it was only in knowing this world inside and out that I could begin to notice what I didn't have, what gaps there were in this archive that spoke much louder than the voices that it contained. My fascination with what we call these silences in the archives was the first element of my research that pointed me towards a larger creative project. I became obsessed with the questions that didn't have answers, because they do, of course, have answers, just not ones that I can prove and cite and point to in a file. I've been asked repeatedly if there's evidence of Hannah complaining about her treatment. Darker still are the topics that not only wouldn't have been documented in the archive, but really weren't captured, even by language at the time. Things like sexual harassment, which is a term that wasn't first coined until the 1970s. So it's hard to know exactly what Hannah's days looked like, and where on the spectrum of bad to worse her experiences at the college might have fallen. Unless she wrote a letter to her family about such an experience, which happened to make its way to our archive, which she didn't, or unless the college documented such a complaint, which could never have been filed, so it wasn't. The only way to make inferences was to round out what I believe the college looked and felt like at the time, and to round out Hannah's personality so I could imagine how she may have reacted and felt in certain scenarios. I also had the opportunity to speak with people who actually knew Hannah. She died the week before I was born, one of the many ways I feel our stories are strangely connected. I met with Dr. Celia Chen, class of 1978, that summer. She shared so many things in our conversation about what those first days of women at the college felt like to those actually in the classrooms. She recalled having only 3 female professors in her time at the college, and Hannah's impact as a mentor really made her career possible. She told me, you see someone, and if they're doing it, then you know it's possible. That's all it is. Hannah being a female faculty member made it look possible. And Professor Chen is now a faculty member at Dartmouth in the very same department. So it was indeed possible. I was able to tell Dr. Chen things about her mentor that she never knew, and things indeed that Hannah herself never knew. Who promoted her? What had been said? These confidential files that were now unsealed. Over and over again, the weight of this story struck me. What it means to carry someone's story, whether they wanted me to or not. Out of this research process produced several findings. My goal was to learn from Hannah's story and take lessons from it that make sense for all of Dartmouth, the Upper Valley, higher education, I knew she would have a lot to teach us, and why she was able to succeed where others weren't is the key to a better future. So the first observation seems obvious, but is worth repeating. No one gets anywhere without their community. A large portion of Hannah's archive is made up of writings about her by deans, department chairs, presidents. The long overdue campaign to promote her involved collecting testimonials, both positive and negative, none of which Hannah ever read, summarized all of these, and still made the case for her promotion. Just as the external structures, the other people, hindered her career, it was also the people around her that had the power to propel her forward. Ultimately, Hannah got promoted not because she was a brilliant scientist and a devoted teacher, which of course she was, but because she had people who advocated for her. She had men who were willing to advocate for her when it was not the majority opinion. Those men went on to be leaders of the college, and of course they did. People in Hannah's community stood up for her because she'd always stood up for them. Hannah was the first woman volunteer fireman in Hanover during World War II when men were scarce. She'd always been handy with an axe and helpful to neighbors after storms caused damage and things like that. But it wasn't until World War II that she could be allowed to have that role more codified, and it took some convincing. I think it illustrates one of the ways that, though of course there were pioneers in academia all over the country, Hannah's particular story really could only happen here. The paradoxically insular, close-knit community that she was inextricable from, but never fully embraced by, is unique and fascinating. At the end of my summer of research, I could not leave this story behind. I saw signs of her everywhere. Her office, which she finally received after years of working out of closets or shared spaces, was across the hall from the very first class I ever took at the college. Jittery on my first day of freshman fall, the walk to Silsby Hall and the spaces around it are like burned into my brain still. But when I realized that this dark office across the hall had been hers, it made me realize that I had been acutely aware of what I was doing that day, my first class at Dartmouth, what that had meant to me, but had not considered how many others had had weighty experiences here too. How many generations of others in the same halls. As a 21st century student, I had not been asked to be grateful for admission to Dartmouth. Another experience that I cannot shake from my time in the archives was reading old issues of The D, combing for mentions of Hannah or anything relevant. I stopped on a front page article because I recognized the common room in my freshman dorm. Countless sleepless nights studying in Little Hall all freshman year played in my mind and made me smile. And then I read the caption of the grainy photo. Students were passionately debating whether or not to let women matriculate. Confronting that, of course, those conversations had happened in spaces that I had felt ownership of in my time living in that same building had changed all of those memories. They're still happy moments, but they are changed somehow. And I wanted others to have this experience, to see the spaces we occupy as belonging to everyone who came before them and who occupies them now, all simultaneously. To see our stories as intimately connected to those who came before us and impossible to separate, even if we do not know who those people are. So I knew I could not let this story go. And one night, I started writing a scene that became the first chapter of my novel. Hannah's living relatives tell me they think she would find it funny that I thought her life important enough to write a book about it. But that, I feel, is really the whole point. The last phase of this project, and the one that I was least prepared for, is happening now. Editing the book with a team of people who didn't understand the references and the nuances I could take for granted about the Dartmouth community and the Upper Valley was an important check on how universal the lessons we can take from Hannah's story truly are. And now the book is out in the world and I have to tell people about it. That's why I'm here. I feel very responsible to steward this story, not just Hannah's, but now mine as a person who discovered this piece of history and thinks that others should do the same. The book launched on November 1st, which was a date I picked to coincide with the 50th anniversary of coeducation at Dartmouth, celebrated that month. It's very timely to be thinking of this story for so many reasons, not just as we reflect on 5 decades of progress, but as we look towards the inauguration of Dartmouth's first female president this year. It's very easy to see these moments as exclusively joyous ones, that in the face of adversity, women persevered. But we cannot create a better future without learning from the past. We cannot celebrate how far we've come without knowing just what that time far away looked and felt like, and also remembering it wasn't that far away. Setting up the Dartmouth women of 50 years from now for the best possible experience means understanding this. It means sitting in what may make us uncomfortable. I believe now that demanding more and being grateful all the same can be reconciled, and we can and must do both. And I think a lot of women, especially at Hannah's time, were forced to choose. So before I open it up for questions, I wanted to take the time to thank the library and the Historical Society, Cindy in particular, for hosting me and allowing me to share this story. It's always so great to hear from people who either were at the college at that time or had the honor of knowing her firsthand. I'm always acutely aware that who am I to be kind of talking about these things as somebody who's just read a lot. So would love to kind of have a discussion and answer any questions that anyone may have.
Carolyn, you are we muted? You mentioned family.
Yes.
What living family or does she still have? Or did she?
It's a great question. I am sure that there's more. I've been in contact with, I think, a second cousin who reached out through the page that was on the library website about the research. So if anyone knows others, I'm very happy to connect. I think it's a kind of a strange situation to be in where I'm, talking about someone who, obviously does have living relatives who have, much more, I think, intimate, things to comment on than, the very academic version that winds up in a talk. So yeah, there's a handful of cousins who were, I guess, much younger than Hannah and have memories from when they were growing up who have, shared pictures and things over email. It's been really wonderful.
I'd like to speak up. It's Susie again. McKenna Road was her neighbor. Now, you have really helped me to understand your history of Hannah when I was so young to not know exactly what she was doing at the time.
Yeah.
At the time. Now, what year was it she got tenure?
1964, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah. She was promoted in 64. She might not have gotten tenure until 68.
Okay.
But yeah, she became a professor in 64. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I have to ask you, knowing that I went into her living room so many times and looked at her amazing botany pictures, do you know whether or not Hannah actually, painted those? Were these originals from her? Or not? What was I looking at?
I would imagine that you were looking at the illustrations that she did for textbooks. So in the archive, there's a lot of tracing papers from illustrations that she did, some of which were actually from samples that she collected herself and then turned into illustrations, and others were kind of tracings of other textbooks, but she was illustrating textbooks on the side to kind of raise more money for rent and things because the college was really paying her so little. So that's probably what it was. I know that her mother was also a painter and painted landscapes of the area. Yes. So I'm not sure exactly what you were seeing, but that's probably what it was. Well, she also really preserved a lot of samples that wind up looking kind of like art themselves, many of which are still very brightly colored, even though they're collected, almost 100 years ago.
My goodness. And if you're saying many of those she did herself,
yeah,
one way or another, did they eventually get published?
Yeah. So she was working with some textbook companies to actually provide the illustrations like on a contract basis. Yeah.
Okay. And how do you feel that Hannah was not only this amazing botanist, but a fireman, a firewoman? How does that connect? How does that connect with you? What
Yeah.
is this about her?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of pieces. I think she always had to really, fight to kind of find her place. She was used to being a part of, communities that kind of made or break or broke her experience as a researcher, the opportunities that she had. And so she definitely had a very strong sense of community. And I think that the responsibility to, your family, the community that you're a part of was something that she took very seriously. And then she had all of these skills from collecting in the field. So I think like her kind of, capability with certain tools. And like I mentioned, she was quoted like being seen around with an axe and things like that, that she had some of those skills that were actually,
Yes.
from the field expeditions she would take to go collect samples. So I think there is actually a kind of correlation between her research and her career and the things that she was able to kind of do for the community.
Yes. Yeah. And as you talk about it, how did the community feel about Hannah as far as darkness is concerned? She to us on McKenna Road was very different than anyone else. And I was so young not to understand that at that point.
Yeah.
But did the people, I'm going to ask you, at Dartmouth feel in any way that she was just not to be included for whatever reason, no matter how brilliant she was? And I think that's what's important about what we forget about these women that do amazing things like this, but were not recognized.
Yeah.
And when did Hannah die?
1999.
1999.
Yeah.
Did she ever get the recognition from the college that she deserved?
Yeah. So there's a couple parts to your question. So I think, yes, she definitely was accepted by certain parts of the community. I think that she did find, a community of students who really looked up to her and people whose careers like were completely changed because they took a class with her and she was such a magnetic teacher, right? So I do think that she was even then a very like important part of the community. Yeah. I think that the college wasn't really ready for her. Like she was facing a lot of structures that even like an example that I often use, I have the annual like kind of HR paperwork that she would fill out every year that was in her file. Wow. There's a box for wife and she would cross it out. Because, right. So like the college wasn't infrastructurally like prepared for Hannah. Right. And I think that in very real, in very real kind of tactile ways that I think even if people were really nice to you, you would still feel that, right? That like you're in a space that wasn't designed for you. So there were some people who were definitely more vocal about that than others. In some of the like memos that were collected, for example, there are some male faculty who were her age, had started before her, even though they both had PhDs, and got, immediately got tenure and had a completely different experience at the college. And the way that they would describe her was like, well, I don't really know why we need to promote her. She would be asked to do things like prep slides for the other professors' classes and things like that. So while there were certainly those at the college who were appropriately impressed by her and knew what they had when they had her there, I do think that, that obviously was not a universal experience. So I have long wrestled with how she would have described, that balance, that there were the people who were recognizing her talent enough to make her feel like she belonged. That's a question that I'm not sure I'll ever be able to answer from, the information that I have left behind. But I think that, it's a really complicated question because she never said really much to the contrary. There is one interview towards the very end of her life that I have of her, where she was asked kind of, how she was treated when she finally was promoted. What was it like going to her first, couple faculty meetings, things like that. And she tells these stories of the chair saying, "We need somebody to teach a class for freshmen. Does anyone volunteer?" And she stood up and said, I'll teach it. No one moved. She sat back down, and the chair said, "Since no one can teach it, we won't be offering a course for freshmen." So, right. So it's pretty blatant. And I think that's how she was recalling the story probably 10, 15 years after the fact. So I think that, those are the kind of kernels that I've really latched onto and said, like, that's all we're going to get from her in terms of her saying this was really, really hard. And I think, like, I've kind of sat with, like, she was never going to say that she didn't feel, a part of the community, but those are the stories that I look to. She was, to answer the second part of your question, there's 2 awards at Dartmouth in her name. There's an undergraduate award for the student or students who do the most to support, women's experiences at Dartmouth. And it's given every year. And she was asked in that interview what that meant to her. And she said, they started talking about what she had done for the women who came after her. And she said, "I never did anything for those women except tell them to be quiet and wait." And that's the title of my book, because that is not what you expect her to say, right? Like that, right? And so I think that's kind of a really long-winded answer to your question in terms of, I think, the really nuanced way that she probably thought about her relationship to the college, definitely, accepted and supported by some of the people that mattered, but probably not, in very aggressive ways by some other people that also mattered. So very complicated.
Do we have another question here? Mary has a question.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about the writing process that you took, and if you feel like you kept it pure, were you able to keep it a pure biography, or do you find it a kind of hybrid, going a little bit into historical fiction? Where does the book fall in that?
Yeah, so it's definitely historical fiction.
Okay.
It is fully a historical novel, and I made a conscious choice not to make it a biography for a couple of reasons. So first, some of the most interesting parts of the story I can't prove. And I wanted to be able to explore, I thought that the reader should be able to explore where some of those complexities were. So I wanted to get into her head in ways that, I couldn't if I was writing a biography. And I thought that was really important. I also, in the novel, compare this fictional professor with a modern day student at the same college. And the story cuts back and forth between the two of them. I also thought that was important to be able to show what's the same and what has changed, and also to kind of reflect my part of this story, which was what do I do with this story as somebody who's really the beneficiary of her struggle. And then the kind of third last piece is that I think people don't often read biographies of someone that they haven't heard of. And I wanted to make sure that the story could reach as many people as possible, because there is something very universal about her experiences beyond just the people who either, knew Dartmouth or knew her or had some kind of connection to her field of study. And when you read fiction, I think you're put into the book, you're put into the story in a way that when you're reading a biography, I think it feels more at arm's length, like it's a textbook, it's like something to learn from, but it happened to someone else. And when you're reading fiction, you're a part of it in a way that I thought was really important for the story. For those of us who didn't experience those things, to be able to kind of step into that world. So yeah, that was the writing process. It was very interesting. As I was workshopping it with another group of writers, I kept being advised to take out the sections they didn't know, the sections that were true, because they said that would never happen. That was the least realistic part, like the story I just shared about the faculty meeting. So that was really interesting also, that I did try to bring in stories I knew were real. And that those were always the parts that were hardest to weave in, because the real stories are the parts that you just cannot believe happened. Yeah.
Carolyn?
Great answer. Thank you.
Carolyn, have you ever checked when women were accepted for teaching or got tenure at places like Columbia and Harvard?
Yeah.
I don't think we were that unusual.
Yeah, that is true. So in terms of teaching, that was all happening around the same time. And, obviously Dartmouth was further behind in terms of admitting female students, but I think that you're right that it was all around the same time for early women professors. The really interesting thing is that, Hannah went to the University of Pennsylvania and was able to, she got her undergraduate and graduate degrees and got her PhD. And so to be accepted at, a peer institution, at that time, her grandmother also went to Penn. So in the 1800s. And so there were some kind of interesting things that I encountered as I was looking into that, one of which being the schools that did have more women faculty, or at least like Penn let women attend, were very narrow in terms of which areas of study women were allowed to participate in. So while Hannah was at Penn, she had a choice of 3 majors, and she was not allowed in several buildings on campus, like fully closed to women.
Really?
Yes. And she tells a story about, Penn undergrads being required to learn a foreign language. And she tried to go attend a French class, and the professor wouldn't have her, even though she was an undergraduate enrolled and needed to fulfill a requirement to graduate. So she wound up teaching herself many languages because I think instead of that experience. So I think that the way that different schools handled it is variable, but along a similar timeline. And one of the things that really kind of struck me was I think that Dartmouth's geographic location definitely contributes to, I think, being more isolated in terms of when we're going to make change in this community and when we're not, as opposed to peer institutions that are in cities or closer even together, that they're going to be, I think, more swept up in some of the change that's happening versus at Dartmouth, we're kind of in a bubble, and that protects the things that we really like, and kind of allows those things to be preserved, but I think also does slow some of that progress. And so when you're comparing,
I came here in 64 and was going to go to graduate school when I found out there were no jobs here.
Yeah.
There was one woman here as a tech who was the brightest PhD in the Harvard biology department.
Yep.
Because I had worked with this guy, and when he said he heard I was coming to Dartmouth, he said, "Oh, she's just absolutely wonderful." She was a lab tech.
Yeah.
And the people who did get degrees would go into Boston to teach.
Yep.
And it's hard to run a family that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that was another thing that I noted about a lot of the early women professors was many of them didn't have children. I think in part because of exactly what you're describing, that just the structure being so not built to support that it wouldn't have been feasible. You really did have to make a choice. Yeah.
Hey, Carolyn, I've got a question. I've recently saw some statistics about today's cultural norms and biases. And there were 2 examples where someone Googled teacher, and the first page of images were all women. And then you could do this and you'll see the same. And then you Google professor, and the first page is all men. And that's today's cultural bias. And so I'm curious if you know Dartmouth's current, or just in general in the US, what the percentage of female professors is today.
Yeah, so that's a great question and a very important point. I don't know off the top of my head the breakdown at Dartmouth, but what I do remember, even from just a couple of years ago when I was an undergrad, certain departments had very disproportionate representation. So I was fortunate to have a lot of female professors because I was taking a lot of classes in departments that had a lot of women, and also a lot of female students. So that was never really something that I had to think about as much as peers maybe in like the economics department. There are very few women in the economics
Mathematics department, my husband's department, there were very few women. Now there are.
Yeah.
Women were not getting their doctorates, so you can't put them on the line
Right.
towards tenure.
Absolutely. And so I think that without doing this research right now, I think that based on the kind of anecdotal evidence, which was the same even in Hannah's day, that that change is going to happen quicker, and that balance happens quicker in certain fields more than others. The kind of confusing thing is that in Hannah's day, the quantifiable fields were kind of the first to be bridged by women. I think, if you were doing something that like English or history, where your expertise is mostly subjective, it's you making an argument, that was a lot harder for women to be taken seriously in fields that are now dominated by women. When you think about, I was an art history minor, the majority of the students anyway, were women. So that's kind of an interesting shift that I saw, at least at Dartmouth and several other institutions that I compared. The early female faculty were in fields like biology, math, languages, which all, were kind of seen as like a technical skill, right? You could prove that you were fluent in a language, and then like the medical school. So that was really interesting, as that has sort of shifted, as more women have been getting degrees.
Yeah.
Interesting. Thanks. Other questions?
Well, it's not a question, but I grew up in Hanover and knew Hannah. When I was young, my aunt came to live with us a couple of years after my mother died. And my aunt was also a college level biology and botany teacher. And she had worked at Woods Hole as well and knew Hannah very well. So I got to know her through that, through her.
Carolyn, where was she when she, in her later time, when did she retire? And then where did she go to following her years after Dartmouth?
Yeah, so she retired in technically like the early 70s, but continued teaching like a class or two. She would be around in the summers. So she did get to overlap with the early classes of women, which I think is very special. But she did technically retire, I think, in 72. And then continued teaching for like probably another 10 years after that. And then she wound up in Florida, which was always, I think, her goal. So she was, that was where she passed away, and she was able to kind of continue to be near the water. And I think maybe some family was there as well, but she grew up in Pennsylvania, so kind of a trek. She moved to forget the name of the town now, but yeah, Florida.
It's Susie again. Tell me about her publications.
Yeah, so she published just an incredible number, and actually there were many revisions of her CV over the years spaced throughout her files, and so you could just see the list grow and grow. And then finally, towards the end of her career, she would have like several pages that were just listing publications. And I think, as I mentioned, part of why that happened was because she grew such a reputation that she would wind up getting, a letter from somebody asking her to kind of co-author something or fact check something, help her with something. She wound up finishing the papers, as I mentioned, of a professor in Finland when he passed away, like several pretty groundbreaking publications she became a co-author on because he had a lot of partially finished work when he died rather suddenly. So she was prolific. And one of the things that was really interesting was, as her reputation was growing from at least within the sort of psychological community, she became particularly well known for her Latin translations. So she taught herself Latin, which obviously is important in the sciences, and as you're naming things and being able to translate is very important. But I'm not sure exactly how she became renowned for that skill in particular. So a lot of the writing that would arrive would be questions about what if this was translated correctly, or am I looking at this the right way, which I found really interesting because I think also at that time, obviously pre-internet, there were probably very few things that she could actually help someone with from a distance, but that's something that you really could offer your expertise and just answer a letter and like totally change the, you know, the trajectory of someone's project. So she was, in addition to her publications, was also kind of like a help desk to a lot of people later in her career. And so
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, before her tenure, however, where she obviously, we know that she was apparently not included in one of those first classes where they said, well, we're not going to have that. We all know that it's important to publish once you become PhD, and you won't get tenure, you know, until you do. Many times. And so how long did Hannah have to go once she got her PhD? How long did it take before they understood that her publications were important, or she put out publications and they didn't think they were important? This is what I'm trying to get back to, in how they did not really understand the magnificence and the brilliance of this woman.
So I think that, so she got her PhD in 1925. So she didn't actually become a professor until 1964, which is staggering. But I think that, you know, your point is really interesting. I think she was publishing, she won the prize, this like Sigma Z prize for the like best graduate PhD thesis when she graduated at Penn. So like already coming out of that program, her qualifications as a researcher were pretty much indisputable. Then she was at Woods Hole for a number of years before she came to Dartmouth. So when she was hired already, she had some significant research to her name, even when she was hired as a lab tech. And so I think that it's not so much a question of how they didn't know that she was as competent as she was. Everyone knew. I think, especially within the zoology department, everyone knew that she was supposed to be there. The question was, do we really need her to be a professor? Don't we have enough professors, right? Like all of the conversation was always trying to find a workaround. It was never that she should be let go. I think that there was very much a pride in the talent that they had acquired, but a threat, I think, for the other men in the department to have her kind of officially join the ranks. So that's kind of, I think, more how to think of it, not how she could have been overlooked for what she was doing, but that there were often justifications made for like, great for a woman, right? It's different. Yeah.
A question for you. Did you totally make up her personal life in your fictional book, or did you have clues to know something of her personal life?
Yeah.
Because that becomes part of your book. I have read your book.
Yeah.
That becomes part of your book, her personal life. So Absolutely. Did you just fake the whole thing?
So no, I didn't totally make that up. I think that that was one of the areas that I wanted to explore, because I think who supported her at times when, you know, life was really challenging was a question that immediately was kind of haunting me while I was doing this research. And she had a number of very close female friends who she would take, you know, trips with, other women who were working in biology, who she would, you know, go on kind of like research trips with and things. Then communities of people who she found when she got to Dartmouth, as well as a very co-ed class at Woods Hole. Several women she like co-owned a boat with, and they would take it out and collect samples and things. So I was really interested particularly in how the incredible support that she got from other women made her career possible, and was so counter to what everyone was expecting. You know, the question's always, well, did she get married? You know, like those kinds of expectations for what someone, especially at that time, would have done. And the fact that she had a very full life, you know, she wasn't like a hermit living by herself, is something that I really wanted to kind of explore. And so the nature of their relationship is not fully explored in the book, but I wanted to represent how important some of the other people in this community were, not just to her as a person, but I think to her ability to persevere through the contrast between her home life and the experiences that she had in the workplace. So there are several kind of people that maybe made an amalgamation of to create that character that I wanted to explore. Part of the reason why I needed to be fiction.
How does Dartmouth College feel about Hannah Crosdale?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So I think that I've been really grateful that the college supported my research in this area. This was obviously something that kind of changed the trajectory of my career, as I, was fortunate to kind of get this experience early on, and now has kind of shifted my writing and my interests. So the college definitely supported that. I think that it's not a positive story, so it's complicated. She is definitely lifted up as an important figure from the college's history. There is a room in the new Life Sciences Center that was built several years back that's like dedicated to her. There's a picture. Her microscope is in a glass case. It's very nice. But I think that people walk past that, and so the ways in which we remember people, I think, are really important. Not just that we name a room, that we have pictures, that we do those things. There are several awards, as I mentioned. So she's definitely a part of campus still. But I think that the most important parts of that story, the ways that can, shape what students are doing now and how they, are aware of the opportunities that they have, and some of the things that I was mentioning a bit before, I think that's the part that is a little more challenging. So we have a very nice version of it that is like first woman to receive tenure, incredible scientist in this building where women are now taking science classes, objectively a great thing. But I think that in terms of, how the college engages with these stories, because there are many others, not just Hannah's, that are equally kind of fraught and important. And we could have, people spending as much time as I have spent on Hannah's life on each of those stories and only begin to unpack all of the multitudes of experiences that built the college into what it is today.
Carolyn, will you do another book, or what are you up to now? Can you share that with us?
Yeah, so I work in communications kind of consulting in San Francisco. So I'm still helping people tell their stories. And I definitely probably will write another book at some point. But I'm trying to do this one the right way. So I definitely haven't, I know how much of an undertaking it is now that I've done one. And I think I want to make sure that I do this book the right way before I move on to another project. I think I'm very aware of, what it means to be telling someone's story, and I'll never know if Hannah was okay with that even. That's something that I think about. I hope that she would be. So I want to make sure that I've kind of given it its due, and that amount of creative energy that I would be spending on another project. But definitely, I've been writing my whole life. I'll definitely continue to do so.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful answer. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, all of you on Zoom. Please encourage us to do more stories like this, more programs like this. And thank you for Zooming in, Carolyn, giving us of your time and wonderful answers. And we love to see young people that are interested in history. It's just so rewarding. Thank you so much.